Greetings to the indigenous people of Australia and to all indigenous people. I personally believe that everyone is indigenous somewhere. We're all natives of Mother Earth, and we all came out from Africa once upon a time. So we are all people of African descent. The divisions that have been introduced historically to weaken our solidarity are slowly withering away. We are coming to the realization that we are all brothers and sisters, and that we should share this earth as brothers and sisters rather than fight and kill each other over millimeters of boundary markings on this small planet. So I'd like to start by giving out a shout to all the ancestors who went up to the mountaintop and surveyed the promised land that we inherited. I also want to big up the living legends, Moana and others, who came down from the mountaintop with a book of the rules and the roadmap to the land of freedom for all, not just for some. I'd like to preface my talk by quoting an African activist by the name of Samora Machel, who was the second president of Mozambique. He spoke in Portuguese, and my Portuguese are almost non-existent, but you will understand what he said when I say it. According to Machel, colonialismo extremo contra humanidade. No a colonialismo democrático. No a colonialismo humano. No a colonialismo no exploradora. I have no idea what he said just there, but it sounds so beautiful when I listen to it. There is a student in the University of London by the name of Mulele, who's from Congo. And Mulele is also a master musician. You can find him on YouTube. And he prefaces every song he makes with a historical quote from a historic figure. And one of my favorites in his album is this quote from Samora Machel about colonialism being extremely contrary to humanity, because there is no such thing as a democratic colonialism. There is no such thing as a humane colonialism. And without colonialism, probably we wouldn't have exploitation, according to Machel. In my work, I see criminology and the criminal justice system as technologies developed for the control of others, for the control of other people. And when I say others, I don't simply mean people of color or indigenous peoples. I mean that the others include also the poor people in Europe who were shipped away from Europe as punishment and brought to Australia, as we all know, transported away from the master race to deny them the opportunity to reproduce because of the assumption that they were of a weaker stock of genes, and if they were allowed to reproduce, maybe they will dilute the strength of the master race and bring about an end to white supremacy. As a matter of fact, I read somewhere that the word race was first used to refer to the poor in Europe. If they are of the same racial stock as the master race, how come they are so poor? The reasoning went, so the poor people were supposed that these are Anglo-white people in Europe and French and German, that they belong to an inferior racial stock. That was part of the ideological justification for transportation as a form of punishment. But those Irish and poor British peasants, when they got to Australia, say, oh my God, this is punishment? They will send a telegram to their girlfriend and say, burn something and get transported. This is paradise. So we're not assuming that all those who were transported were criminals. But the paradox for me, and that I would like you to help me to resolve, is how is it possible that people who were themselves oppressed would rise with the ambition to replace the oppressor and oppress other people rather than to end oppression? You get what I'm trying to say? Why is it that years after the ending of colonial occupation of Africa and other parts of the world, the Africans and Asians who have come to power and the people in South America who have come to power as the peasants of Paulo Freire, whose dreams were not to end the oppression of the peasants, but to replace the landowners and oppress other peasants, according to Freire, in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is a puzzle that I'm trying to resolve, especially because I grew up in Nigeria as a little child, dodging bombs being rained down on me during Biafra War, a war that lasted for 30 months, during which 3.1 million people were killed. They were killed by fellow Nigerians simply because they spoke or speak a language that they call Igbo. And up to today, even Nigerian intellectuals, radical left-wing intellectuals, defend the record of the genocidal state in Nigeria to suggest that the Igbo asked for it. They deserved what they got. There is never any justification for genocide. By definition, genocide is an unprovoked crime against humanity. No matter where it happens, no matter who is the target, it is never justified. There is never a reason for it. Unfortunately, the historical method that we inherited from colonialism always starts with the question, why? This is the problematic of historians. Every historian wants to tell you why something happened, the reasons for it, as if there ought to be a reason or a cause for genocide. What did they do to deserve it? There is never such a thing when you come to the study of genocide. It's always an unprovoked, undeserved suffering, no matter who is the target. And today, standing on a land of a people who were almost completely wiped out, I feel the pain that the indigenous people of Australia have gone through. It is a pain that I understand as a survivor of the genocidal war in Biafra, except that the Igbo were not completely wiped out. I know the indigenous people of Australia were not completely wiped out, but they took a harder blow than we did in Igbo land because ours happened only in 30 months. They couldn't kill everybody in 30 months. But 3.1 million in 30 months, that's a major Holocaust. And it wasn't done by Anglo people or by Germans or by the French. It was done by fellow Africans. It was the foundation of genocide in post-colonial Africa. And because Africans have not adequately responded to the challenge of Biafra, the experiment has continued to be done in other parts of Africa, in Rwanda, in Sudan, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, all over Africa. The genocidal state imposed on Africans by colonialism continues to happen because Africans have not continued the push for decolonization as soon as flag independence was given to those states that were created and imposed on Africans by the colonial authorities. The emphasis has shifted from continuing the struggle for decolonization to the development of a national consciousness. And national consciousness, as Frantz Fanon warned us, is a very dangerous thing because as soon as you succeed in pushing out the foreigner, the tendency is for you to then look inwards to see who is more native, who is more indigenous, and who should be pushed out because they do not deserve to belong to this national identity that we are developing. It's happening all over the world. It's happening in Algeria, it's happening in Ivory Coast. They fought a whole war over who should run for president. Because in Ivory Coast, they have a matrilineal descent system. And this guy who wanted to run for president, though his father is Ivorian, his mother came from Burkina Faso. So they say, you are not truly Ivorian. They call it Ivorite. Therefore, you can't run for president. You should go back to where your mother came from. And they fought a 10 years war over this stuff in Côte d'Ivoire. And Fanon was warning them against it. He actually mentioned Ivory Coast as a bad example for independent Africa, because Houphouët-Boigny said that other Africans were free to come to Ivory Coast, but they will come as guest workers. Fanon said, what is that? Africans as guest workers in Africa, they should be welcome as citizens with full rights. But Boigny said no. And that model that divides Africans according to the colonial boundaries continues to be a hindrance to the push for increased decolonization in Africa. My work in criminology started with black women and the criminal justice system that Chris mentioned, and I was interested in black women and the criminal justice system because in Nigeria, I was already an activist working with women in Nigeria, an organization that campaigned for women's rights as human rights, but allowed men to be a part of the struggle. And so some of us, we are part of the organization WIN. Before I went to the UK for my graduate studies, and at that time, a lot of black women, still the case today, were being arrested in London because they were found with drugs. And so I chose to do my research on the difficulties that those women were facing in the criminal justice system. It is still the case today. If you go to the UK and you release all the black women who are in prison in the UK, who are held in prison for drugs offenses, there will be no black woman in prison in the UK today. I'm sure you've read the case of the Aussie schoolie who was arrested with some kind of powder in Bali. Yeah. Lucky that he wasn't Nigerian. Yes. If he was Nigerian, that might have been Panadol, but in the testing it would turn to cocaine. Yeah. And they will hang him. Right. For something that is a victimless crime, as our brother with the PhD told us earlier. Why would they market alcohol? Why would they market tobacco to poor people in Africa, which tobacco alone kills 6 million people every year worldwide? And it's legal simply because it makes money for big corporations and government revenues. But something like marijuana that has never killed anybody, not even a fly, is illegal. Why? Why is it that here in Australia, indigenous youth are being arrested in large numbers and imprisoned because they are found with marijuana? But if they are found with alcohol, okay, that makes some money for us. If they are found with tobacco, all right, that makes some money for the taxpayer. In fact, we can give some subsidies to the farmers who grow tobacco that kill our people. But marijuana that is medicinal, that our people have used as medicine to treat things like arthritis and severe chronic pain, and lots of other things that doctors want to prescribe. Oh, you can't do that. Why not? Because they can't tax it. If marijuana was legal, everybody would grow their own. But I challenge us as indigenous criminologists or critical criminologists to add our voices in the advocacy against the control freak state. To tell the government, you have no right to imprison indigenous people just because they are growing and using a crop that God created and put to the earth to help people to heal themselves. When I was making this recommendation in my dissertation at Edinburgh University on black women and the criminal justice system in the mid-90s, my colleagues, my fellow students said, are you crazy? They're going to fail you. I said, I don't care. I'm still going to say it. And I did. I called for us criminologists to support the advocacy for the abolition of punishment, for an end to the war on drugs. Now it's happening. It's happening in the US. Not because the government wants it, but because ordinary citizens are putting these initiatives on the ballot. So at the last election on November 8th, 4 more states voted to approve the recreational use of marijuana, joining 4 other states that did that in 2012, in addition to the District of Columbia. That is color activism. So I might not get huge research grants because my name is associated with this campaign. And if you Google it, in the case of Colorado, you will see that I'm one of those professors who signed to support the ballot initiative. And the response was people were blogging to say whether we will lose our jobs as professors who supported something that was illegal. It's still illegal on federal law to use marijuana recreationally in the US, but the example of US voters could be replicated here. I don't know the constitution of Australia or New Zealand enough, but I'm sure if people pressurize the lawmakers, they might put it on the ballot and let the people vote. Or the lawmakers themselves, out of fear of being voted out of office, would vote to give the people, law-abiding adults, the freedom to grow and eat what they want to eat without being a problem to anybody. Even if you cannot tax it, that's no reason for you to make it a crime. And for this reason, lots and lots of our women, lots and lots of our youth are having their lives ruined in prison. Why? Because we live in a control freak world that was designed by imperialism and imposed by imperialism on our people for the purpose of maximizing profit for big corporations. I say this again. The law against marijuana was not made by African countries. It was not made by any indigenous people. It was a law made by imperialism all over the world. And those imperialist countries that impose those laws on us are gradually allowing the law to wither away, whereas our own people are holding on to these oppressive laws as if our lives depend on it. Why is that so? That's what I'm trying to figure out, and maybe you can help me. Why is it that children who were abused as children grow up to become abusers rather than be people who are opposed to the abuse of women and children? I think it's because we live in a control freak world where having control over other people is very seductive. We like to exercise control even over things that we cannot control. And criminology comes in to justify this will to control others by trying to give it a scientific bent, to say that if we don't have enough social control, then the whole world is going to break apart. If we let people in the Netherlands smoke marijuana, the country will go to ashes. They've been doing that since 1975, and the country hasn't collapsed. Right? Portugal joined the Netherlands in 1995. They've been doing it up till now, and the country hasn't collapsed. Uruguay just started about 2 years ago. And as I said, 8 states in the US. Why? Because of pressure. And I'm happy to claim that my own scholar activism contributed to the pressure that is bringing this result. In Jamaica, 75 people were killed by the police trying to arrest a drug dealer about 5 years ago. Under pressure, the Jamaican government has finally agreed to allow medicinal marijuana in Jamaica, a country where coffee, tea, or herb can be offered to you as hospitality. And the politicians want to use it to criminalize the people when they could allow it so that the poor single mothers in the ghettos of Jamaica can grow this stuff and sell them to the crazy tourists who want to use them and make money legitimately with which to pay for school fees, buy food, or pay for medication in a very poor country. Jamaica is. Okay, that's just one example that I want to share with you in case somebody is asking you whether critical criminology can point to any achievements. Yes, we can. We have quite a few, up to and including the rolling back of the spread of the death penalty across the world. In Africa, it's still found in almost every country, or the criminalization of abortion, which used to be universal under imperialism, but is now rolled back as a result of the activism of feminist criminologists and critical criminologists. I found that the colonization paradigm is central to criminology. Central in the sense that there are people who are supposedly being punished in the criminal justice system, but they never broke any law. So, according to legal theory, punishment is reserved only for offenders. But what happens to you when you are being, in quote, punished, but you never offended? Then people on the street will say, that's not punishment, that is victimization. So I found that for black women, when I was doing my research in London, they didn't have to offend. They did not have to break the law before the law could be used against them punitively. And that, in that sense, I said that the empire of punishment was expanding and encroaching, colonizing the concept of victimization. If you read the very influential book by David Garland, who was one of my supervisors at Edinburgh University, Punishment and Modern Society, he starts with the 4 words: punishment of offenders, the punishment of offenders, 4 words. So I told him that is the poo theory, punishment of offenders. That is the poo theory. How about the potty that goes with the poo? Punishment of the innocent? Yes. It's not in your book. It's not in criminology. We talk about punishment as if it is only offenders who get punished. So when you talk about poo, you know what it reminds me? It reminds me of potty. And he said, that's funny, but you can't put it in your PhD. I said, okay. I said, okay, so I finished my PhD and I put it in the book. Punishment of the innocent. So I look at decolonization as an ongoing process, not an event that happened, say, when you got your flag independent, or maybe when Juan and Chris published the book, Indigenous Criminology. That doesn't mean that imperialist criminology is dead. It's only a call to remind us that the struggle against imperialism continues and that we all can contribute to it in our own little ways. Also, when we talk about decolonizing criminology, we should also come to acknowledge the fact that in settler colonial locations, decolonization is not even on the agenda because colonialism and imperialism is assumed to be permanent. But as a result of settlerism. So I like the title of the conference as Decolonizing Criminology, rather than the decolonization of criminology. It's not a finished thing. Besides, as Chris and Juan told us, criminology as a field is an exclusive field in 2 senses. Almost all the former colonized countries have refused to develop teaching and research in criminology. There is no criminology department anywhere in Africa except, you guessed it, South Africa. Same in across Asia. Same in South America, but maybe more recently they are beginning to develop research centers, research institutes, and maybe some teaching. But it's a puzzle. How could we go on for so long teaching anthropology, teaching sociology, but shy away from teaching criminology? It's as I believe because criminology shot itself in the foot by making itself exclusive and by identifying itself as a technology in the service of imperialism. And even here in settler colonial locations where criminology has been taught for quite some time, there is a stringent effort to keep away indigenous people from participation in the field of criminology. Those two tendencies have helped to weaken the potential development of criminology as a field. In other words, colonialism and imperialism are not processes of oppression that affect only the colonized negatively. The colonizers also pay a price. According to an African saying, the only way you can keep somebody on the ground is if you stay with them on the ground. If you want to rise from the ground, then you got to let go of the person you're holding down. Otherwise, both of you are going to be down there in the mud, struggling. I listened to Moana in Hawaii about 5 years ago when he talked about environmental justice from the point of view of indigenous people, and I was fixed, especially after I listened to his YouTube talk on warrior genes, an assumption that the colonizers had as a justification for the genocide against indigenous people is to say that they have warrior genes in their blood. And so as people who are genetically warlike, you have to destroy them all, including the babies. Because when you kill a cockroach, you don't spare the baby cockroaches, do you? This was actually the broadcast in Rwanda during the Rwanda genocide, to kill every Tutsi, not sparing even the babies, because the babies were baby cockroaches who will grow up to become adult cockroaches, parasitic to the majority, they said. And Juan and Kunin took some of these ideas from Moana and joined them with some of mine. Especially what I like about their work that they took from mine is this methodology. Belinda, you might be interested in tweeting this. The methodology of committed objectivity. Because white stream criminology talks about objectivity as if it is non-attachment, the ability to be neutral, whereas they look at the kind of work that I do and other people who are critical criminologists or critical feminist criminologists do, or indigenous criminologists do, as ideological, not sociological. But I have argued in counter-colonial criminology, in a chapter there, that the best we can approximate as researchers is committed objectivity. So the people who say that they are objective only are actually committed to maintaining the status quo. That is their own commitment. Those of us who are committed to changing the world and making it a better world for everyone, we're also committed, but we do not lack objectivity. When I said that 3.1 million Nigerians were killed by their own government during a 30-month civil war, I'm not lacking objectivity. I'm not just being subjective. When indigenous people talk about genocide and oppression, it's not simply an ideological statement. It's also an objective, verifiable fact. So I call for committed objectivity. You're objective, but you're also committed to making a change. And those people who say that they are only objective, I remind them that they too are committed to maintaining the status quo. So there are 3 or 4 models that I have in my paper, and when you read it, you will then follow the argument completely. The models of decolonization that are possible in criminology, that have been developed outside criminology, in the social sciences and in history. The first being Frantz Fanon that I've mentioned. You're all familiar with Fanon, although Fanon is usually critiqued as somebody who is an apostle of violence. That is the red flag that is used by empire to discourage us from reading Fanon, to silence his work after he died at the age of 36. Well, Fanon was a psychiatrist. Fanon looked at violence with the eyes of a psychiatrist to say in his work that people who are violent are really crazy people. Right. And my job as a psychiatrist is to heal them away from violence. And that was the work he was doing for the French colonial administration in Algeria, to treat the people who were tortured and who became violent under torture, who would run down the street with a kitchen knife, screaming, "I'm gonna kill the man!" And then they get shot down by the police. Or to treat the torturers who have a 24-hour job torturing people. That kind of stuff, that kind of work can go to your head. So they finish torturing people, they go home, and they continue to torture their own wives and children. So Fanon was treating both of them, and he said, "This is an impossible job. I quit. I'm not treating anybody again. I'm going to join the national resistance to end all this nonsense and thereby save people from going crazy." Fanon was not an apostle of violence. In fact, he advocated that what we should do is to use our literature, in this case, criminological literature, to mobilize the people in the countryside, to educate them and prepare them to prevent a handful of phantom bourgeoisie from taking over from the colonizers once they are gone. These are ideological struggles rather than violent, bloody struggles that are usually associated with Fanon. So it is a non-violent struggle, mainly. According to Fanon, when you read The Wretched of the Earth, through education, mainly, to change the minds of the people, to develop science and technology, to take the political party away from the urban centers and mobilize the countryside, educate them about their rights so they can vote accordingly. Another model is the model of decolonization, which Samora Machel talked about when he talked about colonialism as something against humanity. I hope my own work will contribute to the decolonization model, and reviewers of Black women and the criminal justice system, my first book, say actually yes, that I was contributing to what they call the decolonization paradigm. But also evident in my work is the influence of Stewart Hall, the Afro-Jamaican immigrant in England who developed the concept of articulation, that is race, class, gender articulation or intersectionality, as a better way to explain the dominance of empire, even at the end of empire, as something that doesn't affect only the colonized, but also the poor people in Europe today. So that when you talk about the new right coming to power in America under Trump, or of Brexit in Britain, or of the Liberal government in Australia, and the rise of the far right in France and Germany, the tendency is to think that these things are threats to only the immigrants who are being excluded. But Stewart Hall reminded us that it also affects the poor people in the centers of empire. And that is why we need to build coalitions that go beyond simply Black people, and that go beyond simply women, that go beyond simply working people, to bring our stronger coalition of all the people who are struggling under the domination of imperialism to push back and offer an alternative capable of rallying all these other people behind a platform that promises a viable alternative. Thatcherism succeeded in the UK because there was no alternative to Thatcherism being offered by the left, according to Stewart Hall. Okay, so I call that articulation model. It is a model that emerged from the work of Karl Marx, where Karl Marx actually wrote in Volume 3 of Capital that race can be regarded as one of those structural conditions that are not chosen by people who make history. People make history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. And race relations, or the politics of race, is something that you don't choose. You just make history given whatever condition you find yourself in. This concept was taken by Harold Volpe to talk about cheap labor under apartheid, to remind us that it is wrong for us to say that apartheid was just another form of capitalism. Because if we say so, we're assuming that poor whites in South Africa would support a struggle against apartheid as a system of capitalist exploitation. But it would be ridiculous, given that poor whites, as a result of white privilege, were actually the stormtroopers of apartheid who implemented the domination against black Africans in South Africa. So that it is actually an articulation of race and class exploitation that was going on under apartheid, according to Volpe. Stewart Hall applied it to the UK to show that it isn't only the colonized who suffer Thatcherism, but the poor working class whites also suffer the impacts of authoritarian populism. If you read the article by Paul Mason in The Guardian a couple of days ago, he talks about this authoritarian populism as an explanation of the rise of Trumpism in the US, but he presents it as if, following the statement by your minister Dutton about Lebanese immigrants being the people causing trouble in America, in Australia, you would think that the rise of the far right is actually a threat only to immigrants. Stewart Hall is saying, no, it's not only immigrants who are going to pay the price. When Thatcher, the milk snatcher, for example, ended the supply of milk to schools, it's going to affect all working people in England, not just the immigrant. Okay, so, and of course, Stewart Hall was also influenced by Gramsci, who talked about the region, southern Italy, where he was born, and which was conquered and colonized by northern Italians. It was during the conquest of the southern Italy that Lombroso served as the Italian military prison doctor, and that's when he discovered the skull of a notorious brigand that led him to the conclusion that criminals are born that way. They got criminal genes, if you like. So finally, I would recommend that we revisit the work of Pashukanis, who talked about the withering away of the law, the withering away of the state, as something that could be very revolutionary when we allow it to happen. Pashukanis was following the idea of Marx, according to whom, once upon a time, just because the capitalist class makes contracts in their businesses, they assume that the human nature is defined by contracts. So they said that what explains the world we live in is something they call the social contract. Marx said there was no social contract between the settlers and indigenous people in Australia, for example, or between millions of Africans who were enslaved and the slave masters. There was never any such contract between men and women in the oppression and exploitation of women. It was force, it was robbery, it was conquest, it was brigandage, according to Marx, not a social contract. And Pashukanis is saying that once we have a socialist revolution and the revolution becomes a communist state, the capitalist law would wither away because the state under capitalism is only an instrument for the oppression of another class. So when there is no longer any class to oppress, when we come to a classless society, and John Major will say, classless society, not in this age, not in any age, that there will always be classes, according to Major. But in Marxist theory, there is always that projection to a communist society when there will no longer be a repressive law, when we will take from each according to their ability and give to each according to their need. Problem for Pashukanis was that he was theorizing this under Stalin. And Stalin didn't find it funny because rather than the law withering away, more repressive law was being made under Stalinism. And so, you guessed it, Pashukanis was disappeared under Joe Stalin. But there is still a possibility to think along those lines, and I call it an indigenous perspective, because Marx was borrowing these ideas from people of African descent in their struggle against slavery. If you read Volume 1 of Capital, there are hundreds and hundreds of references to the struggles against slavery by Africans and their allies. And Marx said to the working class, you need to study the abolitionist movement against slavery because that is the model for the abolition of the capitalist state and the victory of socialism over capitalism. I will leave it here and take your questions. Thank you.
Yes, questions, please.
I guess for me, the fact that Cannon was a psychiatrist and that he acknowledged the trauma that people had been through and how that plays out a really strong story for us as Indigenous people as well as everybody else who's been traumatised in this, through colonisation. And it's a story that it's part of the lack of healing that's not being provided to people. And I guess the question I'm asking is, how do we acknowledge that sense of intergenerational trauma that continues to be part of this space in criminology?
That's a good question. And that goes back to the methodology that I talked about earlier, the methodology of committed objectivity. Fanon, as a young man, volunteered to go to France and fight the Nazis. He was not conscripted. He was born in Martinique in the Caribbean, but he said what the Nazis were doing wasn't on. He didn't just want to sit down and write a poem or play or novel. He said, I'm going there to kick butts. And he did. And as a psychiatrist, so he was also a scholar activist, using his psychiatric skills to heal people, not just write about it. And that's what we need to be doing as criminologists, not just write these papers to get promotion, but write papers that can even get you fired. If the bosses ever read what I'm writing, I'll be out of a job. And this happened to me when I went to the US newly. The first thing I did was to go to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. I was working in Pennsylvania then, and they had a public hearing on race and sex bias in the criminal justice system. I presented a paper to them. I said to them, look, you have death penalty for juveniles. That in this day and age, you can't have that. Plus, the vast majority of the young people who are on death row, juveniles on death row, we are black. So in the state of Pennsylvania at that time, there were 6 people on death row. 5 were black. So I told them, you got to end this. You got to end death penalty, period. Because there are lots of rooms for error in the death penalty. We cannot trust criminological science to help us to determine who deserves to die. But this is the dominant tendency in criminology, to say that reforms can be put in place to make sure that the people who are being sentenced to die are the ones who deserve to die. I said, no, you got to end this stuff. It shouldn't be an option. Luckily, a few years after the US Supreme Court ruled that juvenile death penalty was unconstitutional. That was the first paper I came to present here in Australia, in Brisbane in 2002 at the International Sociological Association. I do hope that the Supreme Court justices read my written submission to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to condemn juvenile death penalty. But that is an example of activism. The death penalty wouldn't end without some activism. David Garland wrote a whole book about it. He called it the peculiar institution. How is it that the US is retaining the death penalty when almost all industrialized countries have abolished the death penalty? But curiously for me, David Garland started his book by saying, I'm neither for nor against the death penalty. Damn it, you should be against it. As a criminologist, you should be against it. Yes?
I can hear that you're passionate about drugs within the system, and you mentioned marijuana, and at one stage you mentioned all drugs altogether. So at the moment there's an issue, there's always some issue with some type of drug, and ice is the one that Australia, I believe, is what they're focusing on at the moment. Do you believe the criminal justice system is putting youth away and even adults with drug issues as an answer instead of actually putting services in place to help them outside of the prison system?
That's a good question. We shouldn't have the assumption that the people running the criminal justice system are evil people. We shouldn't, like Hillary Clinton said, that they are deplorables and irredeemables. These are people with good intentions. The road to hell was paved with good intentions, we are told. They actually want to make a difference in the lives of those young people whose lives have been ruined by drugs. And some of my colleagues, African Americans, say, you can't call for the legalization of drugs. I'm from a family in which I have witnessed loved ones wasted by a drug habit, right? But the question is, are we relying on a solution that makes the problem worse when we know that education is what works? See, tobacco is legal, but I can almost swear that most of you here don't use tobacco. Guess why? Because education has already convinced you that tobacco kills and that you shouldn't be giving your money to corporations that do harm to you by your own free will. Except that tobacco habit is not free will, it's habitual. So it should be treated as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. It should be treated as an educational issue rather than an incarceration issue. And this wouldn't happen if, for example, criminologists in Australia do not rise up and tell the government, back off. Back off the young people. Naughty, naughty, nanny. Right? Yes.
All the issues that we sort of deal with now in this modern day, because I heard you mention the settler colonialism, and we have the government committed to constitutional recognition at the moment. From your perspective, because from my perspective, as an Indigenous person from Sydney around Botany Bay, this country wasn't settled, there was an invasion. Do you think that, and also I understand in colonisation, a lot, since the UN's been set up, a lot of decolonisation has happened where people have been given this process where they just flow back and go through decolonisation, people do that. But that will never happen here. But governments have recognised substantive sovereignty or self-determination in best practice models all around the world. Do you ever think that Australia will give us that right? Is it a matter that Australia somehow can dodge all of this, and just keep, because to me, Australia is worse than South Africa, but from what I can see, people of colour come to Sydney. I've run into a couple of African American people over the last 3 years. And they scoured the streets of Sydney looking for Aboriginal people. One particular lady came up to us and she had tears in her eyes because she couldn't find any people.
Oh, thank you for gracing our meeting with your presence and sharing your thoughts. For me, it's a privilege. It's like you're giving me a gift. I don't have to go now looking for Aboriginal people and Indigenous people because I've met you here. But when it comes to the struggle for freedom, it's never a gift. According to the African American anti-slavery abolitionists, why is the name escaping me? He says that Frederick Douglass. He said that power never concedes anything without a demand. It never has, it never will. So we have to make the demand for increased decolonization, but strategically point out to the poor whites in Australia that this is also in their interest. Yes. The decolonization of the empire in Australia will benefit everyone, not just Aboriginal people. Just imagine, Australia, a very wealthy country, allows Indigenous people to live in conditions worse than in fourth world countries. I read that elders were being allowed to starve to death in the Northern Territory, and that young people were being abused in detention in the Northern Territory, and that the rate of incarceration in the Northern Territory outstrips the rate in South Australia, as Anthony and Black did in their paper that was published in my journal in 2014. So we got to mobilize everybody to fight this struggle. Imagine that Indigenous people in Australia are allowed the opportunity to live their lives under conditions that are capable of being supported by a very wealthy country like Australia. Imagine how much boost that would give to the Australian economy, generally, benefiting everybody. So that is why I ended with this idea of nomophilism that I borrowed from a colleague in Flinders University, Maria Giannakopoulos. I hope I'm saying her name right. Yes. She talks about nomophilism as the love of law, that we as human beings love the law so much that we are always offended when anybody breaks the law or goes against the law or even argues against the existing law. She calls that the love of law, nomophilism. But the way we practice it, I think it is more than nomophilism. I think it is nomophilitis. I think it's some kind of disease, a very infectious disease. So maybe we should go beyond the love of law and go to the law of love. The concept that the first lady who introduced us mentioned, the law, L-O-R-E, of the Indigenous people, going back to the love of our folklore, or rather the law of love, which according to Gandhi is like the law of gravity. Whether or not you believe in gravity, it works.
I can relate to Gandhi, because Gandhi's principle was the truth, and the truth is that when the British came to Botany Bay, there was resistance there, and I don't understand how a country can be founded or settled. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So that initial thing, you think that,
yes,
can be righted, the truth can be.
Yes, and that truth, that truth was taught to Gandhi by the Zulu, because Gandhi went to South Africa. Gandhi went to South Africa to fight for more rights to be given to the Indian businessmen so that they would not be classified at the same level as black South Africans because they were more civilized. Their color was lighter than the black South Africans. So when Gandhi got there was a Zulu uprising against the British Empire. Gandhi said, what nonsense? The British are here to bring some enlightenment to the dark continent. You all should be bowing down to the British and say, thank you very much. So what did Gandhi do? Gandhi joined the British Army and was commissioned Sergeant Major Gandhi to help to put down the Zulu uprising. This is according to Gandhi in his autobiography, right? But during the fighting, all the people who were wounded were black people. So Gandhi was frustrated because he really wanted a British officer to be wounded so that he and the volunteer Indian nurses would treat the wounds and show the British how civilized the Indians were. But they didn't get the opportunity because the black people were not fighting back. So Gandhi went to them and said, what are you guys doing? Why are you sitting there like sissies? Why are you not fighting back like men? So they laughed and said, but we're fighting back. We're fighting back non-violently. When we refuse to pay taxes to a government that doesn't represent us, that's called non-violent resistance. And when we refuse to go to work to employers who exploit us, that is called non-violent resistance. When we refuse to shop at stores that discriminate against our people, that's non-violence. Gandhi said, oh my God, I thought when you all don't want to go to work it's because you're lazy. They said, nah, it's part of the struggle. So he took that back to India to replace the mutinies in India with non-violent resistance to help win independence for India, according to Gandhi in his autobiography. Not everybody knows that. Yes, Melida?
Sorry, we do have to
All right, I'm running over my time.
No, it's all right. And so could you all join me in thanking Biko?
Thank you, guys. Oh, wow, thank you.
Thank you.